wanted to be the security guy. He claimed he was a security guy.
Welcome to a Windows XP version of Security Guy Radio with Chuck. I grew up on DOS Herald. And Paul, no show Bristow. Mr. Brian, the engineer, where's Mr. Bristow today?
I'm right here.
That's a bad Paul.
That's a bad everything, actually.
I'm sorry.
Just a bad Paul.
We were talking about that in post. That'd be a good idea, but now that we executed it.
Paul is caught on a security emergency, as we like to say in the business. And unfortunately, a lot of things in security are emergencies. I suppose you're wondering why I call this a Windows XP version.
I wondered, yes.
Do you even know what that is, by the way?
Windows XP, yeah.
Do you know what DOS is?
I still use it at home. I use DOS, too.
You do not use DOS.
I not use, but I used.
You weren't even born when DOS came out.
Yeah, but I got my hands on a lot.
Okay, so here's a terrible story. So I was a cop in '84. Windows was just getting started. I think we still had DOS, and then 3.1 came out. And I said, I should buy stock in this place called Microsoft. And my cousin was working up there, and he just started. And I was precluded from doing so. And I wish I had, because I would have been split several times. Same thing with Google. I should have bought Google when they said we're going to put everything on the internet. But I digress. Now, did you see that our demographics are? Did you notice this?
Yeah, I saw.
Now, we have 4,000 listeners a week now. That's really good. Better than 50 our first week.
I'd like to thank every single one of them individually right now.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Now, did you happen to do these demographics using a Microsoft product? I bet you did.
Yeah, Word.
Excellent.
Word and Excel.
And Excel on
two great programs.
And you email me with Microsoft Outlook, right?
Yes.
And I do all my graphics for my radio show with Microsoft, right? Now, it's just a coincidence once again how these shows happen to work out, where we're talking about a subject, and we just happen to have a guest that can speak to us for Microsoft. And today, Mr. Brian, we are going to talk to Mr. Mike Howard, the Chief Security Officer for Microsoft. Welcome, Mike. How are you?
Hey, Chuck. How you doing?
Good. Thanks
Happy
for
to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for calling in. I know you're really, really busy. I wish Paul was here because he had some good questions too. But we're gonna get through this today.
Great.
Chief Security Officer for Microsoft Worldwide, correct?
That is correct.
So can you share a little bit about your background and career? I know it's interesting, and it'd be a good perspective and understanding on how you ultimately became the CSO of the world's biggest technology company.
Sure. Well, I guess from a background standpoint, I'd always wanted to be in some type of law enforcement or intelligence organization. I grew up in California, Army brat. But I guess it was in my DNA. I always wanted to be a police officer. I ended up going to San Jose State University in California. I majored in criminal justice and sociology. And those of you who are long-term Californians will remember Proposition 13.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the old Howard Jarvis bill that was going to cut all the property taxes within California. So I was in my senior year of college and had an instructor that used to be a detective sergeant with the Oakland Police Department. He'd been hurt on the job, and he had encouraged a lot of us to try to get into the public safety arena, before the bill passed, which it eventually did. And so I applied to a number of departments and joined Oakland, and had a really great experience there in learning about people and doing law enforcement. I know you, Chuck, have got a law enforcement background as well, and thoroughly enjoyed my time there. But I always wanted to see the world, and had read a book on how it's called Piercing the Reich by a guy named Joseph Persico, and it's all about the World War II exploits of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services.
Oh, yeah.
They were the precursor to the CIA, as you know. And I went across the Bay Bridge there to San Francisco at that time. Believe it or not, the agency had personnel offices that were kind of open. I applied. This was during the Reagan revolution, as they call it. They were beefing up military, law enforcement, intelligence services. They were looking for people with law enforcement backgrounds. I kind of got swept up into that. And it took about a year of processing and testing, et cetera, to get into the agency. And spent the first 6 years with CIA in their Office of Security. which does similar things to what we're doing now in our global security office at Microsoft. I did investigation, some defector protection, did some adjudication on backgrounds and that type of thing, and ultimately worked on the director of CIA's security detail, William Casey, who himself had been an OSS operative in World War II and who Reagan had appointed as a CIA director and the first CIA director to be a member of the cabinet. And as being on that detail, I ended up getting to know a lot of the people in the Director of Operations, the clandestine side of the house. And at one point, we were encouraged to move over to that side of the house in the newly formed Counterterrorism Center. It was around 1986. And so we were part of the first wave of people that joined this fledgling thing called CTC, which was a combination of our operations group, which I was part of, as well as our analysts. And I spent 22 years at CIA, primarily working at CTC. Spent a lot of time in Asia and Africa and other places. I also took some time, however, to do some other things, which I think basically helped me in my career. I was in HR for about a year and a half doing career development and recruiting and starting a mentoring program. Worked with the military and Office of Military Affairs, was in the Inspector General's office for a while, and finally ended up as a Chief of Station, which is the highest ranking field position, both domestic and international, and ended up as a domestic Chief of Station in Pittsburgh. And I was there in the unfortunate incident of 9/11 when one of the planes went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We worked a lot with the FBI, obviously, on that one. And then at that time, my wife is retired agency. I had put in for some other assignments, but basically we wanted to get back to the West Coast. I sort of put in my time. Parents were getting a little bit elderly, so through a number of means, I was able to connect with Microsoft. They were looking for a director of executive protection to run protection for Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer and some of the other executives here. And because of my background with the DCI security staff, I was able to get on board Microsoft that way. And as it turns out, the way it happens here at Microsoft, Chuck, tends to be a lot of reorganization. And I know you've got a lot of experience in the private sector as well, so you know what I'm talking about. And 1 year later, I was called in to the office by my then boss, who said, "Oh, by the way, Mike, I'm moving on. There's been a reorganization. You're not taking over all of the then corporate security, which is now Microsoft Global Security."
Now, with your CIA background, without disclosing too much, I assume you knew that was going to happen.
Yeah, probably so. You didn't have to be an intelligence analyst or an expert par excellence to know that was probably going to happen. Yeah.
It does happen. I mean, in the studio biz, the average tenure tends to be 18 months, for executives in some positions, and you kind of know what's coming and you kind of see it. But I was just a little joke, but I know what you're talking about. There is turnover all the time like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been a good marriage. I've been here now going on 12 years total this September at Microsoft, thoroughly enjoying the work.
So how is it set up in relationship to the C-suite? I had this issue at both Fox and Disney where, there's cooperation, but then the business is driven by cost factors. It's not necessarily driven by operational factors. And, you got to balance all these things and get the buy-in from the C-suite. How do you work with the C-suite over there at Microsoft?
Sure. That's a good question. It's been an evolving kind of journey here. I had a bit of an advantage when I first got here, Chuck, because I worked in executive protection, which automatically gave me entree to the C-suite. And I did a lot of knocking on doors, even in that position, introducing myself to a lot of the people in the C-suite, telling them what we did. And so that was sort of the initial grounding. Over the years, one of the things that we do is we take a look, my leadership team and I, we take a look every fiscal year at, okay, who are the leaders in the company that we'd like to really bring into the fold and get them to understand us better in terms of what we do for a living and what's the ROI back to the business. We have a bit of an edge in that regard because we've developed a program with our operations centers called Showcasing, where over a period of time we've brought in a majority of the C-suite folks at Microsoft, both at Redmond and a lot of folks in the field, and we introduce them to the technologies that we have in our operations centers. They blend the best of Microsoft technology and partner products, and we show them how we're more efficient, but also how we're working with the sales teams at Microsoft to bring in enterprise clients and customers and potential customers. So it's a combination of exposing them to what we do, sort of what the risk is, obviously, to the company, but also showing them that, with what we have and what we've developed, we've been able to actually bring money back into the company and become a virtual profit center and really get tied in with the COO's office and the sales team. But it's as you know, it's a constant effort. I think we have a really good relationship with the C-suite, but we constantly look every year to make sure we're targeting the right people to evangelize who we are and get them to know us better.
It's really internal sales. I mean, I went to the same thing when we had to convince somebody of a corporate purchase or a capital project. You had to sell that there is a return on the investment. I remember one year we had one of the executives at one of the studios came to us and said, "Can you guarantee me that if you cut the security force in half, you'd have no thefts?" And we said, "Well, no, we can't do that." So he said, "Well, cut security force in half." And we did. And by gosh, he's C-level for a reason. He was kind of right, because really the effect was, okay, we had a couple more computers stolen, but that doesn't equal $1 million in labor. So, I get what you're saying, but you really got to get them to understand. And my experience with the C-level people is that they're really so focused on the business, and they don't view themselves as targets. They don't view themselves as, why would somebody want to interfere with me or my business or my family? Because my experience is they're great people and they're leaders, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to convince them that they have to have somebody in the background to kind of watch them,
Right. No, I agree with you. You just brought something to mind, Chuck. I remember I've told this story a lot recently when we're giving these presentations to different groups. In fact, we recently had former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff visit one of our operations centers, and we briefed him on it. But I remember my first year here when I was still running executive protection, and we were called into a quarterly business review by my then boss and then his vice president. And I wasn't running, obviously the physical security part of it holistically, just the executive protection part. But I remember, the VP going around the table talking to other business group leads, about their business, really getting into it. And then when he got to the physical security person, he said, "Oh, yeah, you run the security stuff. You're the guys in the white cars riding around the campus, right?" And it just always struck me to this day that was his optic.
Right.
Neither good nor, it wasn't malicious. It was just that from his point of view, we weren't business enablers. We weren't, the only thing we were was kind of break glass in case of fire, right? And
right.
That was kind of the optic that we've been trying to change for the last 12 years.
Well, I know you're a proponent of managing security as part of the business, and I really believe in that myself. It's kind of a change in how security is viewed by C-suites. Can you give me any insight on how you made inroads into that? Because I've always had that issue of trying to get in there and sell the concepts as being a return on investment. And like you said, we don't want to be viewed as the guys in the white cars with the badges really not contributing to the business. How did you get insight into that and overcome that?
Well, I think part of it is actually luck, and part of it I think is strategy. The luck part was that we ended up having a really great boss who is the corporate VP for finance and administration, basically the chief accounting officer for the company, rolling up to the CFO. This particular gentleman had worked in another company for 20 plus years and dealt with security issues a lot. So he had an appreciation for security. So that was kind of the luck part of it, because he's over the years given us plenty of support and air cover when we've needed it. I think the other piece of that was that, part of it was what I talked about earlier, trying to get yourself out there and evangelize and talk to some of the C-suite members. But the other part of it is really understanding the business. I think that if you, as any kind of corporate security group, if you don't really study up on the business, you really don't have any credibility. So it was a building block concept. I remember years ago, my leadership team and I went through a session where we started reading the 10K. I think a lot of corporate security leaders don't know what the 10K is or don't really care. But obviously, embedded within the 10K, which is a yearly document that comes out from publicly traded corporations, and it identifies really what's going on in that particular business, what the main lines of business and the strategies are, but also embedded within that 10K is an area called the Board of Directors Risks, and really outlines what the board is looking for in terms of risks. And within those risky areas, which includes competition and other things, are things like terrorism or crisis situations or theft of intellectual property or what have you. So, we started doing that, and we were able to start talking credibly about the strategy of the company. And it's kind of like a ripple effect. The more people you bring into, say, our operations center, whether they're a VP of sales or a VP in operations, or they're working the mobile devices or working, gaming, Xbox, cloud, what have you, if you can start talking coherently about their lines of business, about what holistically about the overall strategy of the company, all of a sudden they start looking at you in a different light. Certainly, our ability to work with the COO's office in a really symbiotic relationship with them when it comes to engaging customers has gone a long way as well.
Mike, hold that
the other
thought.
thing we've done,
I got to take a quick break, and we'll continue that train of thought in a minute. Back in a minute on Security Guy Radio.
All right, Jeff.
Welcome back to Security Guy Radio with Chuck Harold. Follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. My guest today, my very special guest, is Mr. Mike Howard, Chief Security Officer for Microsoft. Mike, welcome back.
Thank you, Chuck.
Now, I'm sorry we kind of cut you off on that last break, but you were kind of finishing up your thoughts on how you can kind of get the C-suite to buy into incorporating security into the business plan. And I work for three major corporations. And I see this a lot in my contract side of the business. Major corporations that don't even have a security policy manual. I know Microsoft does, but it's amazing how many corporations don't really put that at ground level and build it into the whole business plan, either as a cost center or a profit center or something in the middle. It's kind of a afterthought, but you seem to be very successful in getting this buy-in.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Chuck. And I agree with you 100%. One of the things that before the break I wanted to emphasize was we also leverage some of the things that we use on a daily basis in straight security to try to get that buy-in. So, for instance, we have an intelligence analysis team, and they're global, and they obviously pump out a lot of information daily throughout the different regions and the businesses that we have. In terms of threats and things that they need to be aware of in the future. So one of the things we started doing a couple of years ago was we came up with the concept of an executive intelligence summary. And this is basically a short 1 or 2 page document we send electronically to the top executives of the corporation. And it really gives them a snapshot of what we think may take place the following month that may affect the conduct of business. So, for instance, we're readying up June's Executive Intel Summary now. It'll go by regions, and we thought it would be good for them to see us being proactive in trying to support the business. Well, over the last few years, it's really taken shape. We've gotten a lot of good responses, and again, we're reaching out to more people in terms of our business leaders and telling them what global security is. That has also morphed into a document we do twice a year called the Intelligence Estimate, kind of based on a U.S. government kind of model where we take a more in-depth look at to what might happen to business from a geopolitical standpoint. We've partnered with our corporate strategy folks for their content. So again, it's not just a security document, it's a combination of security and corporate strategy document. And again, from a perception point of view, it's kind of like, hey, these security folks are really trying to be good, trusted advisors and business enablers. So that has really helped us out in our quest to get the C-suite on board.
I did something like that at, let's just say, a studio. I'm not going to say where exactly, but the executives. This is when years ago when Google was, not quite as indexed as it is, but it was still powerful.
Who?
Google. Google had
What company was that?
I beg your pardon. When Microsoft search was not as powerful. Anyway, we would just kind of run some name searches. One of the executives we found on these websites, the hate sites, right? So here's the Arab hate site, but I also interestingly found a correlation to them on the white supremacy hate site. Now, when I did some stuff in the background, looked at it, they literally had the same language on both of these sites, and then looking behind the scenes, doing a who is, we found out that those websites were actually owned and operated by some prince in London from some Middle Eastern country. I can't remember which one. And it was fascinating, right? Because why are these two groups, are they working together for this hate speech against these executives on these different websites? Two groups you think would not work together? Or was this just all, misinformation or, one message from one group that's spreading in different ways? There's just a lot of stuff out there. And it was very helpful that one of the executives we found out actually had a warrant for their arrest. And I think it was in Belgium. They were considered an ecological criminal or something like that. So he said, you better not you better not go to Belgium. You're going to get arrested. There's an actual arrest warrant. So these things, when you open their eyes to that, because again, they're focused on growing the business, they appreciate it. And I think it's really important to get that buy-in. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the issues you encounter globally? So, when a tsunami happens, when Arab Spring happens, or, kidnapping, extortion, or a GSOC technology, your business is affected. It's a global business, and it's going to affect security. So let's say,
right.
How did the tsunami affect Microsoft? I mean, locally there's branches, but there's, not network issues per se, but just the physical side is affected, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was huge. The tsunami itself was on the tail end of the Arab Spring. And, at that time, we had built up our GSOC solutions, 3 of them, one in Hyderabad, India, and one in the UK, and then one here in Redmond. And so we were managing multiple crisis management teams at the same time. With Tsunami, it had a huge footprint, obviously, in Japan in terms of Microsoft presence. So in the immediate, obviously, it's really trying to look out for the care and welfare of our employees, accounting for both travelers as well as people who are based in Japan. We had a site that was near the epicenter, and so we had to really account for those people. Luckily, with the tools that we have at our disposal now, what would have taken us a few short years ago, a couple of days, maybe even up to a week to try to locate everybody, we could do it within 24 hours.
Wow, that's outstanding.
But certainly that was part of it. Then the other part of it is, when you fire up an incident management team, you're not working by yourself. You're working with your embedded partners, so finance and the businesses, et cetera. So part of it was helping them with the business continuity, making sure we have alternate sites and getting people safely to those sites. And then because of the severity of the tsunami, this particular instance, we have this protocol for incident management. And it starts out at a local level, and then really gets up to the regional level. And this particular incident was so big that it involved several regions. So we fired up our enterprise incident management team, which I ran for the very first time, and which obviously we were able to draw in from all of our embedded partners like legal and finance and HR and PR. So we could give the C-suite the one version of the truth and really manage this thing from a crisis standpoint.
Well, that's the secret right there.
Those are the big things. Go ahead.
They need the truth to make the decisions for the business, and that's what's so important about having those centers set up to get the right information to make the right business decision.
Yeah, you're right, Chuck. Because in your experience, and your experience is the same as mine, right? Something bad happens, the balloon goes up. People tend to want to drive information up to the highest echelon. Sometimes I try to be more of an optimist than a pessimist. So sometimes for well-meaning reasons, but a lot of times for self-aggrandizement, and a lot of times the information is not correct, and so then you have to kind of retrench, and so when you get the right version, the one version of the truth, everybody's on the same page. It helps them make better decisions that we need to execute off of.
Well, yeah, I've had that.
So,
You probably had that experience in the field. I mean, as a cop in the field, the first thing you hear is usually not the fact. It's not the truth. There's always versions of it. So I tend not to. I'm with you. I tend not to react or overreact initially to some crisis or incident until I gather the facts, and then you boil it down to a noun, a verb, and a direct object, so they can make a decision on that. If you have a bunch of opinions and adjectives in there, it can cloud the field and cloud the truth, really. And that is so important in a crisis because everybody's saying, oh, there's a tsunami, and well, how much water did you have? Well, there was 100 feet of water. Well, it was 3 feet because the water heater broke, right? I mean, you got to get all the information so people don't make mistakes. So, when it's hard to get that fed in there properly.
Yeah, you hit on something too that it was part of our strategy as we were building out the GSOCs. We were very, very what we call Redmond or headquarters centric, a decade ago. And so when there was a crisis or an investigation, we'd fly people out of Redmond. Well, Colin Powell's got a wonderful phrase that the field is right until proven wrong. And I've always adhered to that. So we made sure that every line of business we had here in Redmond at headquarters that we replicated in the field, and many times using the GSOCs as a hub. And so we have regional security managers, all of them coming from the areas that they're managing, so giving us the ground truth as to what's happening. So it's not headquarters saying this is the state of play. It's the field telling us, no, this is the state of play. We've got eyes on. We can see what's going on. We're talking to the local authorities, et cetera, et cetera. And that way, I think it's a better model than a headquarters-based model.
Yeah, I agree with you. I always looked at myself as a consultant to my other properties around the world, right? Because they know locally what's best as far as making a decision locally, and then they coordinate with corporate to help make a corporate decision so it affects the whole company. But when you first came to Microsoft, I guess it was kind of more of a strictly local. And can you share some history of how you converted the independent, so to speak, operational centers, and sold them into working with corporate? Because that's not always an easy thing to do.
Sure. Yeah, that was a bit of our journey. I guess it started, as soon as I was told I was taking over, I did a bit of due diligence, and we used to have what they call a life safety control center here on campus, at our main campus in Redmond, Washington. It was built in 1995, and at the time, it incorporated the best of whatever technologies were available. A couple of things had happened that led us to formulate the GSOC concept. Number one, things were allowed to atrophy over a period of time. What you'd have, as I like to tell folks, very well-meaning people in our group, which was smaller then, who would go to a lot of trade shows and go to ASIS and that type of thing. And they'd see some pretty cool widgets that they'd think, hey, that would be great in our life safety control center.
Right.
And over a period of time, you ended up having 60 different widgets, right, that didn't talk to each other and all that other good stuff.
Yep.
And so that was sort of one thing. The other thing was at the same time, Microsoft was growing. So when I got here in 2002, we had 40,000 employees globally. Within a couple of years, we had doubled that.
Wow. We
were starting to get exponential growth in India, China, et cetera, et cetera. And so we knew we had to do something. We couldn't scale. We had these other centers. Nobody was talking to each other. We were using a lot of man guarding that we probably didn't need. So we did a zero-based study around 2004, soup to nuts. It really came out with the fact that we had these 16 disparate technologies. We changed the paradigm. So before it was technology first, then strategy. Now it's always strategy first, then technology. The upshot of that was the concept of GSOCs, each of them with their own areas of operation, but with the technology embedded in those GSOCs so that if one, let's say Redmond goes down because of a catastrophic incident like an earthquake, any one of the other two GSOCs, Hyderabad or the UK, could take over all life safety in the North America, right? And that you could,
right.
Right.
Which is just
continuity operations.
Yeah, just like really how they build the redundant servers around the world. You don't keep all your servers in Los Angeles.
We were able to get rid of all those other control centers.
So you actually save money by making a local center more autonomous, able to make their own decisions and globally, but locally, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. We had one center. We had one of these small centers in London in one of our old MSN buildings. Maybe six security officers. After the GSOC was built in the Thames Valley Park campus in the UK, we gave that building back to the business. Didn't need the security officers anymore, and we replicated that over and over and over again globally. We were able to save the company millions of dollars in manpower costs.
So if we look back and try to understand how the technology was integrated, can you share your thoughts on how your team at Microsoft and the security industry is going to move forward with that? I assume you guys have absolutely not an unlimited budget, but you probably have a nice budget. And since you're a technology company, I'm going to assume you get first view at the latest, greatest thing.
We do. We're very fortunate in that regard. I mean, we've had some incremental budgets over the years because I think we've proven ourselves, as we've talked earlier in this interview. But certainly, I have a very robust technology team, so I'm very blessed to have that. And they keep the trains running in terms of card access and cameras, et cetera. But obviously, to your question, we're looking forward. We're looking at smart technology integration, near field communications, perhaps using your mobile phone to access, access control instead of using badges with embedded, technology, and then smart cards.
Well, now could it be that I'm ahead of Microsoft because I do that with my consultants right now? Oh my!
Yeah, we're trying to replicate that in a secure way on an enterprise level.
Hey, Mike, hold that thought. We're going to we'll come back and we'll talk about leadership when you get back. Back in a few minutes on Security Guy Radio. That's securityguyradio.com. Back to Security Guy Radio with Chuck Harold at securityguyradio.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn, where we use all Microsoft products to produce our show. Welcome back, Mike.
Thanks, Chuck. I appreciate that shameless plug.
I had my first computer in '84 when it was 2 floppy drives. And those were the big 5-inch giant things. And one was the operating system and one was the program. And I had Frogger, Quicken, and it was what they called an 8086 processor. And it took about 15 minutes to count from 1 to 1,000,000. So I brought it in the police station and said, "Hey, Sarge, look what I got here." And he says, "What's that?" "Well, it's a personal computer." "We don't need personal computers in police work. That's ridiculous. Get it out of here." And I used to write all my reports on a Cume Daisy wheel printer. And I plugged it in one day and I put a little DOS prompt and I said, "Watch, it's going to count to 1,000,000." And I think it took like 10 minutes to do it. But that was amazing back then, right? And that darn thing was it was a televideo, and it cost me $2,200. And I had to finance it with the San Gabriel Bank because I only made $1,200 a month as a policeman. And then a hard drive came out, and a hard drive was 25 megabytes, which means it was 25 floppy disks. And that was like 25 megabytes. Oh my God, I don't have to use 25 disks. That won't even run Word now, So it's amazing how fast this technology has developed. And do you think it's exponentially leaping forward? I think, people assumed in the 80s, 90s, there was maybe a little lull in technology, but smartphones have leaped forward so quickly in the last 5 years. My phone is 100 times more powerful than my first computer. It's just amazing. Just amazing.
Yeah. No, in fact, you just, when you were talking about back in the day, I'm sure you remember, like I do, when we got the first, those big AT&T phones that, the battery weighed, 25 pounds, and you slapped the antenna on the roof, and you really thought that, oh, this is pretty modern, Right.
And your cell phone cost $2 a minute for LA Cellular. That's what it cost.
Yeah. No, things are changing exponentially. Obviously, I mean, we I mean, I've seen our evolution in global security here. 2005, when the London bombings went down, that was actually the last time we've ever managed a crisis where we had a group in London and a group here in Redmond in conference rooms, on conference calls, really trying to manage the incident, trying to locate people and communicate. Since our evolution with the GSOCs and our ability to virtualize our operations, everything's been virtual. We've managed whether it was the Arab Spring, the tsunami, or kidnapping crisis situations globally, it has all been virtual, using the tools that we have at our disposal to communicate, to share information, to collaborate, and to really put together some good, company-wide enterprise crisis management protocols. So it has technology has really changed the way we look at how we do our business. Now we're obviously looking at cloud, migrating hopefully a lot of our edge devices into the cloud. Our technology teams are looking at that, how to use mobile devices more robustly in the crisis management situation. We're even looking at some technologies where you turn your mobile phone really into a radio, a two-way radio that you can actually correspond with other people who have two ways. They've tried it, I think in the first Obama inaugural, they were able to really bring in multiple jurisdictions with the Secret Service on that. So again, it just keeps going on and on and on. But luckily, we have a good research arm that looks at it. But the mantra always is that it's the strategy first and the technology. We're never going to go back to where we were a decade ago and get involved in that mess.
Yeah, it's got to be the strategy first. And that's lost on a lot of people. They think the tactic, is the end result, but you can't get to the tactic unless you have the strategy. I always teach my employees / guards or whoever works with me to look at an A-10 Warthog, right? Because it's the only airplane that was actually designed to not get shot down. That was the order. The government says, build me a plane that can't get shot down. Oh, well, that's an idea. Nobody ever thought about that. It's a lot of redundancy in the flight systems and the engines, and engines can switch around between each other. Now, the technology is great, but what do you see as the downside of the technology? In other words, good old relationships, really, from your part of the business in the CIA, that's really what it comes down to. Do you think there's a danger in losing the relationships because the technology kind of creates a distance and then you don't get the whole story? And I'll tell you a little quick story about that. So when I was at Disney, I used to get up and get to the studio about 5, and I'd read all these newspapers from around the world, and believe it or not, the best newspaper was the People's Republic Daily from China. So I'm sitting here reading it one morning, and they say there's a train bombing in London. I'm going, oh. So I'm looking at CNN, Fox, nothing. I'm looking locally, nothing. And I had written a white paper, I don't know, about 3 or 4 months earlier saying, you know what? I see these train bombings around the world, little tests, and our headquarters is on top of a train station in London next to the Coca-Cola headquarters. Probably we should move. That's probably indicated. And then it happened, right? So good thing the terrorists aren't that smart. But anyway, I found that the Chinese newspaper had this story, I'm not exaggerating, hours before it hit us over here. And I was fascinated by that. So there the technology serves people well on that side of the pond, but here was a delay where maybe, back in the day it would have been a phone call from your cousin or your buddy saying, hey, we just had a bombing. What's going on? Let's get out there. Can we rely too much on the technology to feed us information?
Yeah, I mean, I think the technology is a tool in your tool belt, right? And, even though we're a technology company, we recognize that as well. So, if something happens, like, and we get attacked in some part of the world, or there's an incident that happens, certainly we're going to use the technology to, really transmit that information quickly in a format that we can share with our C-suite members. But before that happens, we have several looks at it, including we have those intel teams and our regional security managers. And then if the balloon really goes up and we have to fire up an incident management team, then folks here in Redmond will have, a rich way of communicating with them. We use a thing called Link, which is our instant messaging service, where you can get rich content, and you're, obviously it's kind of like our version of Skype, but on steroids. And you can have those kinds of touch points. Certainly, I think to your other point, though, you do need to have that human interaction. And so as much as we can get out in the field and press the flesh and talk to people and really get some ground truth. My leadership and I team, we do that a lot. You can't learn what you need to do from Redmond. You need to get out into the field. So I think it's a good marriage and a combination of both. You have to have both, but certainly the technology has made our ability to scale to events a lot quicker.
So that's a perfect segue to talk about leadership. I know you are a big proponent and you spend a lot of time speaking about that. I see you on LinkedIn doing seminars and such. And to me, I think especially in our industry, that is probably, if it's not the singular most important issue or way to run a business, it probably is very close. Because I think if you don't lead from the front, if you don't get out and see your local TV stations that I did, or you see your local, GSOC centers that you have, you're just a name on a directory. And people aren't going to necessarily do what you ask them to do or buy into your program unless you're actually leading from the front. So how, can you tell me how, your leadership model really works at Microsoft as opposed to, other companies that have a head there, but there's really no leadership? Because I think you have the leadership.
Yeah.
That's my view.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I think we put a lot of effort into it. It sounds kind of strange, but there's a building block concept that we've tried to apply over the last, let's say, 8 years, 9 years. And my leadership team and we've been together a long time, which is kind of unusual in the company, but we have been. I think one of the first things we started doing was really emphasizing the fact that we are continuous students or constant students of learning about leadership. We read books, we read biographies, we share leadership resources with each other on a regular basis, so we all kind of grow. A few years back, we actually spent a lot of time on productivity training because, to me, being a leader means you've got to be somewhat strategic. Yes, there are times when you have to be tactical to put out a fire, but leadership means being strategic. So we spent a lot of time on productivity, how to manage your email, how to manage your time in your calendar so that you can bake in every week some time to be strategic, some time to read the leadership resources and to absorb those. It's got to be part of the DNA, part of the program. Otherwise, it becomes really haphazard. And then so, we started building on that. One of the things we also pride ourselves on is that we emphasize each of us having mentors as well as mentoring other people because you learn from both, as you well know. Then in the industry, I belong to an organization called ISMA, International Security Management Association. It's the #1 world organization for CSOs. And in that organization, we've established relationships with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., as well as the Northwestern University Kellogg School of Business. And we've created programs in conjunction with them that we send CSOs and a lot of their next generation security leaders to. And it has nothing to do with security other than the fact that we're all security people. It's all about business acumen and business strategies and leadership. So we do a fair amount of that. And then, again, understanding the business it goes a long way towards that leadership. I've started something a few years ago called the Kitchen Cabinet. So if you remember reading about Kennedy, and after the debacle in the Bay of Pigs, where I'm sorry to say, my old folks my old compadres in the agency back in the 60s led him astray, and along with the military. So when the Cuban Missile Crisis came about, he decided, I'm not just going to get my information from one source. I'm going to call in academics and other people. And it was through that kitchen cabinet process that came up with the concept of a blockade, which eventually worked. And so I formed a kitchen cabinet a few years ago with a lot of my next generation security leaders. And again, we meet with them on a regular basis. They take turns, driving the meetings and talking about leadership areas. We share, again, the resources that my leadership team and I do. Over a period of time, you can really drive some good leadership within the organization. And of course, you mentioned, your social media presence. We leverage social media a lot, as you well know, to try to really promote leadership.
Well, I think it hits it on the head. I've worked for, the big studios and some other major corporations as a consultant, and it's evident in the highly successful Fortune 50 companies, let's say. They have that one component that's consistent. I've never seen it not consistent. Mike, I'm going to take another break. We'll be back in a minute on Security Guy Radio, securityguy.com.
All right, Chuck.
Welcome back to Security Guy Radio. That's Security Guy Radio with your host, Chuck Harold and Paul No-Show Bristow. Mr. Brian, my chief engineer, filling in today. Mr. Brian, how do you like the show so far?
I love it.
All right, excellent. And did you learn something?
I learned everything. I learned a lot listening to this program, and this one was no different.
All right, excellent. I appreciate that. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and check us out on securityguyradio.com. Please check us out on securityguyradio.com, a Microsoft product. Welcome back, Mike. How are you again?
Good. You are a good man. You are a good man.
It's always on the edge between, the Microsoft and the other fruit product.
Yep.
And
Yes.
I've stayed. It's the model, The other one's good, but this one's overall, it's just more efficient. It's easier to use, So a big fan. Way from the beginning when it was just DOS, the disk operating system.
Yes,
and you took
absolutely.
it away from IBM, who called it the OS. I think they were just like OS 1, right, or something? IBM's version, and the DOS came
Yeah,
in.
they just weren't fast enough.
They weren't fast enough, and it's again, this is all part of the the business model. Successful businesses
Right.
have certain components like leadership that allow them to succeed. And poor IBM, how did they lose that? What happened? It was leadership. I'll guarantee you that's what it was. So let's talk. We got about 6 minutes left, and let's talk about a couple kind of broad stroke things. Where do you see the greatest challenges for Microsoft in the next 5 years? And I'll tell you what I think. I think I'm really big on this workplace violence thing. All right, so 40% of most workplace violence issues have drug-related components, right? And so if we screen for drugs, we just eliminated a possible 40% of the workplace violence issue. But as people become more connected, they become less connected, and there's a lot of this terrible shooting up in Santa Barbara. The guy has a manifesto and stuff. What do you guys do about this internal? I want to call it an internal threat because I think employees pose a big challenge. They're stressed out. Something happens. They lose their health insurance. I mean, there's all kinds of things going on now in the world. It's a little dicey. I think we just need more training of employees to act as independent. How would I describe it? Become your own independent security consultant. Take care of your own personal safety in conjunction and working with the global security plan. What's your thoughts on that?
Sure. No, you're right. I mean, we tell people that with all the technology and all the resources we have at our disposal, you're never going to have enough cameras and security officers, blah, 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 to cover everything. That you have to use the employee population as that, proverbial force multiplier. So to your point, we have invested a lot of time and money in our education awareness program. We purposely put those people globally around the world to work with the regions, to work with HR, to get content out to people about, minding out for their neighbors, looking out for their fellow employees, reporting anything that they might see that's suspicious. We also have a very well-trained group of investigators globally that are trained in threats of violence issues. We deal with them, I think, on a fairly regular basis, and we've been able to really de-escalate a lot of situations. Try to really get out there with our HR counterparts to talk to businesses about what things to look out for if something like that happens. Certainly, I agree. The world is getting more tense and complex. A lot more pressures on people, so you need to be watchful of that. For us, we're also looking at the fact that we've just acquired Nokia devices and services. We now have added to our employee population by thousands of employees and 8 other manufacturing facilities, and so that adds the added element of supply chain and leak prevention and all kinds of other things. When you look at globalization, it continues. We're going to expand footprints in Africa and China and other areas. That adds more risk to our portfolio. Those are the things that sort of keep me up at night, making sure that as we expand the footprint, we have the resources, the people necessary to cover that footprint. And certainly the threat of violence, crisis situations, attacks upon our personnel from terrorist groups or anarchist groups or what have you, those are things that are foremost on my mind.
I agree with you. I think I always built a model around protection of people first. And the old models were, I got to put up a wall and a guard and a gate so my computer's not stolen. I got insurance for computers. I don't have insurance for 5 people getting shot. And if you build a model where the employees feeling safe is not the right word to say it, because individual security and how you feel is your personal view. But I think you have to let them know that you're paying attention and they're part of the process. Then I think you have a more successful physical security program. Do you find that you have some cultural differences since you're so global? Do you find there's a lot of cultural, maybe, I don't know, resistance might not be the good word, but how do you deal with one market, in Asia and one market in Europe with employees? So they have different cultures of things that are hard to kind of organize in the same group think for security?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some things at a 25,000-foot level that transcend those kinds of things when it comes to threats of violence. But certainly, I think what we talked about earlier, by really regionalizing our operations. So, if I look at India, I look at my regional security manager. He's from India. He was a fairly decorated military officer with combat experience, but he understands the culture and the communications people we have out in Asia can, obviously work towards making sure that in the Indian market we're presenting content that they will not just understand, but they would appreciate and embrace, as opposed to, it might be a little bit different in China, it might be a little different in Latin America. But that's why it's vitally important that you have people that are from the areas that you're working in that can understand those cultural divides, or cultural differences, I should say, not divides, differences, so that you can tailor that content appropriately. But with the common theme of life safety and looking out for your employees, fellow employees, and making sure that you're really watching out for each other and reporting bad things to security.
Mike, we have the fade out music. Mr. Brian, I wish we had more time. Will you come back and finish up with us, maybe?
Absolutely. This was an absolute pleasure, Chuck, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. It's quite an honor, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Join us next week on Security Guy Radio, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And please follow us on securityguyradio.com. Until next week, thanks for listening.